Let's split up and look for clues. Shag, Scoop, you go this way, while Daphne, Velma, and I will go the other way. Welcome to another episode of the Unmasked History of Scooby-Doo, the podcast where we delve into the mystery of Scooby-Doo media, getting clues from people who helped bring our favorite mystery-solving dog to life on various platforms, and maybe eating some Scooby snacks along the way. I'm your host, Alexa Lawler.
Scooby-Doo, where are you?
And it would have been mine if it hadn't been to those meddling kids.
Gang, we've just been handed our next mystery.
Blasted meddling kids.
This week, I had the pleasure of chatting to Scooby-Doo and Guess Who writer Mark Hoffmeier. Mark wrote 2 episodes for the show, A Mystery-Solving Gang Divided, which features the ghost of Abraham Lincoln and the Funky Phantom crew, and Attack of the Weird Allosaurus, which naturally features Weird Al Yankovic. And just as a side note, in a few of his stories, Mark mentions Daws Butler as being the original voice of Scooby-Doo and Astro from the Jetsons. However, I believe he was actually talking about Don Messick, who voiced Scooby and Astro, while Daws voiced other characters like Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound, and for the Scooby franchise, Scooby-Dum. Hi Mark, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Alexa?
Good. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's fun to talk Scooby.
Definitely. So if you're up for it, I'd like to start off with a quick 3-question trivia game.
Uh-oh, okay.
So question 1, who had the most appearances on the new Scooby-Doo movies? A, The Three Stooges, B, Batman and Robin, or C, The Harlem Globetrotters?
I'm going to say the Harlem Globetrotters.
That is correct.
I used to have to answer the trivia at Hanna-Barbera when I worked there, so.
Question 2, can you name 3 villains from the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You series?
3 villains. I don't know if I specifically can. It all gets so mixed together, too, because my era there, when I was at Hanna-Barbera, was a pup named Scooby. And also they had just finished up the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. So Vincent Price he wasn't a villain, though, I don't think. He was like sort of their guide, wasn't he?
Yeah, in the 13 Ghosts he was.
Yeah, okay. So I actually can't do that. I can't name a specific villain.
Yeah, no problem. And question 3, true or false, the Funky Phantom has appeared twice in Scooby-Doo TV episodes?
I'm going to say yes.
It is true, yes.
Okay.
Once in Guess Who and once in Mystery Incorporated.
Yeah, I know he appeared in one since I wrote it.
To start off the general questions, what's your relationship to Scooby-Doo? Did you grow up watching?
Well, yeah, I grew up watching Scooby-Doo, and then the really cool part about it, in the late 80s, I joined Hanna-Barbera I worked in the publicity department. I worked as an assistant, and then I sort of moved up to arranging interviews for a lot of the voice cast and stuff. So I not only got to see a lot of the production stuff on Scooby-Doo, and then my very, very first piece of animation writing was I did a short rewrite on a scene as sort of a test for one of the producers, and that was on a pup named Scooby, which was really fun. But I used to get to take Daws Butler out to do interviews where he would talk about Scooby. And so that was really fun because Daws was the original voice of both Scooby and Astro, and so he would talk quite extensively about that, and that was really, really fun.
That is awesome. Do you remember which Pup Named Scooby-Doo episode that was?
I have no idea. I know it involved, was it Velma in a chair with curlers on or something, or a barber chair, and it was spinning around. So I don't remember the specific episode name, but I remember what I remember was, around that time they were doing a lot of shows that were like baby-fied versions of classic shows. Like, you know, they were doing the Flintstone Kids, and that was the big pitch that people would make us. Let's make it a babyfied version. But I remember thinking that the pup named Scooby designs were really, I thought, some of the cutest of that era of, you know, like, you know, Muppet Babies and all that kind of stuff. I thought the way they redid a pup named Scooby, it looked really cool. I thought it was really well done.
Definitely. Yeah, I love the designs on that one.
Yeah, it just looks great. It's a really fun show.
And did you ever watch the new Scooby-Doo movies, which also featured celebrity guest stars?
I think I've maybe seen one of them. A buddy of mine wrote the one with the wrestlers, one of the most recent wrestling ones that came out. Um,
Okay.
and now I'm trying to think, was it John Cena? Maybe I'm trying to remember what wrestler was in the movie. So I've seen parts of that one, and I think they hold up. I think it's great that Scooby is one of these timeless characters that sort of everybody relates to. And what's great is I remember the early stories about how the show was pitched by Joe Barbera was that he wanted to do a sort of a serious mystery show for kids, you know, and so he had the van and he had the kids, and that's why, you know, some of the original backgrounds are kind of scary. And then one of the network execs he was pitching to said, you know, well, I think this might be too scary. And Josie says, well, what if we added a dog? What if we added a talking dog and his buddy? And that's sort of how that idea was birthed. Was it came from not wanting to make it too scary, and I think he really had great instincts for finding something that people and kids in particular can relate to.
And why do you think that adding the formula of having celebrities on the show works?
I think it gives it a really sort of terrifically fun, almost like a movie of the week for kids, you know, because around that time there were a lot of like movie stars would guest on, you know, movies of the week. That was a big thing. And I think you know, when I was a kid in the 70s, they had, I think, was it the Sunday night mystery theaters on, I want to say NBC, and they had like Macmillan and Wife and all these they had McCloud, and there were all these movies where people solved mysteries. So I think it was sort of a thing at the time to do, and I think it just, you know, throwing in guys like Don Knotts and you know, Jonathan Winters, and of course the Harlem Globetrotters, who were just great at that time. I remember going and seeing the Harlem Globetrotters live with Curly Neal and Meadowlark Lemon, and they were not only amazing athletes, but they were such great showmen that it added this great component to see them in animated form, you know, doing their stuff with Scooby, you know, and guys like Jonathan Winters, you know, what a great take. And then, you know, Sandy Duncan, I think, was in there. And for the stars, it was great because it was an easy, I mean, that's an easy day of work, actually. They don't have to get into makeup. They don't have to, you know, memorize their lines. And that doesn't mean it doesn't take skill and talent to do the voice acting, but it's just different. So they can just go into Hanna-Barbera and do a recording and, you know, and have fun like that. So I think it worked out very well.
And if you could pick anyone to guest star in Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, and if you also got to write the episode, who would it be?
Oh, it would, for me, the huge fear would be Patton Oswalt. I love him. I think he would get into it, you know, because he's got a daughter, a young daughter, and he's done voiceover stuff. He's a very fun guy. I think it would be fantastic.
Okay. I'd like to delve into a few general questions first, and then kind of go off into a few more specific questions about the two episodes that you wrote, if that works.
Sure.
So, to start off, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
I knew in high school, actually. I did a lot of writing for the high school newspaper, and I wrote some poetry. And so I sort of knew by high school that I wanted to write. And I didn't know exactly how or where or what that would mean. So I've sort of since then, I've always been writing. And so then when I got into college out here in California, I was also writing, and like my roommate and I in college did our own sketch comedy show. We wrote and produced a sketch comedy show in college. I wrote a bunch of short stories in college. So, and I wrote for the newspaper extensively. So I sort of always knew that's what I wanted to do. But I also liked performing. So it just sort of came down to, in my case, that I was making more money writing than I was performing. So.
And how did you get into that publicity job for Hanna-Barbera?
I had a friend of a friend. Hanna-Barbera at the time was owned by a company called Taft Entertainment, and they were based in Cincinnati. And Bill and Joe had sold Hanna-Barbera to Taft Entertainment, I want to say in the early 80s, late 70s. And they were retained as, co-presidents of the company, but it was owned by Taft Entertainment. And Taft not only had, it was before the huge broadcasting conglomerates that we have today. So they owned numerous television stations in the Midwest. They needed, syndication product for syndication deals. Hanna-Barbera could do that. And I believe Taft also owned certain theme parks. And so that's how they also got the characters put out into theme parks and stuff. And they also had the heft then to be able to go make licensing deals for things. Although interestingly, the deal for Flintstone vitamins and I believe Flintstone cereals was made prior to the Taft deal and was made, as they say, in perpetuity. So in other words, those deals are going to go on forever. They can keep making Flintstone vitamins and Flintstone cereals as long as they want. So that was before deals got renegotiated every few years. That was just done like, here, you want it, you got it. So he called me up, and there was actually a job in the mailroom. So I started in the mailroom, and about 5 weeks in, I was a messenger. I used to have to do running around delivering stuff. And about 5 weeks in, a job came up in publicity, and most of the guys that worked in the mailroom wanted to go into production. So they were waiting for like a production job to come up. And I was like, well, this has to be better than driving around in my car in LA when it's hot out. And I talked to the head of publicity, my boss, Sarah Baisley, and she was like, well, there'd be a lot of like writing of bios and talking to like directors and writing up press kits. And are you comfortable writing stuff? I was like, yeah. So I got to do that. And that was really fun because I got to do things like, I remember there was, they needed an article written for TV Guide that I got to co-write with Mr. Hanna, and it was all about the Flintstones. And it was sort of updated versions of the Flintstones, like who would come visit Bedrock now, and so I got to do stuff like, well, it would be Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? It'd be all that kind of fun, Flintstoneizing the modern stars, and that was really really fun that I got to do stuff like that.
That sounds like so much fun. What was your favorite part of doing that?
My favorite part of doing that was actually arranging and going out on interviews with the voice actors and stuff. So like Dawes Butler was a favorite of mine because Dawes would often get like, you'd end up a lot of times on what they called morning zoo radio shows. That's the guys that are going real crazy. And hey, oh, we got the traffic and now it's a helicopter. Woohoo, what's going on? And Dawes Butler was actually, he was actually very serious. He was a very great voice actor. He was also a DJ, and he also voiced Dr. Benton Quest on Johnny Quest. So that was actually his real voice, was this deep sort of resonant voice that he would give and he'd say stuff. And so it was sort of weird that he also did all these talking dogs. And so people would ask him, they said, yeah, well, I see here on your credits, you do a lot of talking dogs. So, you basically, you're Astro and Scooby, and they're sort of the same guy, aren't they? And then they'd go on. And Dawes would stop and say, no, let me correct you there. Astro and Scooby are actually two different voices. You see, Scooby is actually a very deep chest voice like this. Ah, I want a pizza. Whereas Astro is actually a throat voice. Rye, Rorge, rye, rub you. So they're very, very different. And I would just sit back in awe of like the fact that he's sort of scientifically breaking down the vocal differences between Astro and Scooby, and it was great. And Frank Welker, who was Fred, would come along on those interviews, and of course he's now Scooby, and he would come along and he would do voices, and it was just great to be in the room with them. And I got to meet a lot of people setting up interviews for them. I got to meet like Little Richard, and I got to meet Tim Curry did some stuff for us. I got to meet I can't think of his name. The guy who was Tim Matheson, who was the original voice of Johnny Quest. A lot of people don't know that, but when they did the new Johnny Quest, I set up a photo shoot between the voice of the new Johnny Quest and Tim Matheson came in, just posed with a Johnny Quest photo, and Tim Matheson was so nice about it and so professional, and I realized, well, yeah, this guy's been in the industry since he was a kid, so he knows how all of this works. So it was a really fun time, and it was really great setting up all those interviews and stuff.
How did you transition into writing episodes for various different series?
Well, when I was in Hanna-Barbera, I sort of got I sort of got a reputation as a jokester. I did a lot of jokes around the studio. I was also working as a stand-up comedian and doing improv comedy, so people sort of knew me, that I could do jokes and I could do that kind of stuff. And I got to be friendly with some of the people who were producers there. A good friend of mine, Lane Reichert, who was the producer head writer on Pup Named Scooby, sort of knew this, and I had gotten a writing agent because I was actually specking, what they call specking. I was writing scripts for live action shows like Miami Vice, and trying to get into that work, the original Equalizer on TV, trying to get into that. And so I think he'd read one of my scripts or something, and he had this rewrite on a couple of scenes from Pup Named Scooby, and he asked me if I wanted to do it, and I said sure. And then from there, I just did some freelance scripts. They had a show called Monster Tales, which was really great. It was done by a friend of mine called Don Doherty, and Don was a real classic cartoon gag man. And he'd been trained by Tex Avery, one of the guys that helped train him, and it was a show where it was the pets of famous monsters. So it was like Frankenstein as a dog and all this kind of stuff. So the very first script I wrote was for Monster Tales, and one of the voice actors on that show was Jonathan Winters. So I got to go to the record and see Jonathan Winters reading my words and then riffing and being funny, and it was fantastic. It was really great.
Awesome. Do you have any influences on your writing?
Influences, wow. I don't know. I mean, a lot of my influences, I mean, it's so weird. You get, and this is going to sound so odd, but like it goes back to like Shakespeare. I did a lot of Shakespeare in college. I read a lot of Shakespeare in high school. Sort of the classic writers. Hemingway and his sort of, really not curt but tight style. I think screenplay wise, there are a number of guys. It was funny because I remember when I was first getting into it, you could go. There was a store on Hollywood Boulevard, and you go down and you could buy scripts, leftover scripts from old television productions. And I remember getting an early script for Simpsons, and it was written by Conan O'Brien. It was the classic. It was the monorail episode. And so like reading through that and seeing how do they play out their jokes, how do they do this kind of stuff. I remember reading some early Miami Vices that were really, I don't remember who wrote them, but that kind of stuff. So it was really a combination of sources, but a lot of it with writing for Hollywood, for screenwriting and television, a lot of that is just the formatting. So you have to really just sort of sit down and understand what the formatting of the scripts are. And so that, it was really helpful to actually read scripts, to actually be able to sit down and look at scripts. And that was a really fun thing to do.
And what are the differences between some of the more earlier writing, like writing for the newspaper and stuff, and writing screenplays?
I did a lot of feature writing for the newspaper. So feature writing, a lot of lighter stuff, a lot of, news. The way I was trained was strongly formatted, and you tried to, pull out a lot of your opinion and just dispense information. Whereas, like feature writing is a lot of fun and fluffy, and how do you get people interested in stuff? So that was a lot more useful. Also that, and ironically, sports writing, because sports writing, if you've ever read the sports page, a lot of jargon, a lot of puffed up stuff, a lot of funny way to introduce quotes. There's a lot more opinion on the sports pages because everybody has an opinion about who's the better pitcher or who the Dodgers should be batting, third in their lineup. So those influences help, but there's so much that goes into like learning the formatting of television writing, and specifically, like sitcom writing is different format than screenplay writing. At the time, animation writing was very different because at the time, in animation writing, they wanted you to suggest scenes and shots. They wanted you to sort of direct the episode on paper so that the networks knew what they were getting. And that's all changed. And I think that's good that it's changed because it gives the storyboard artists more freedom to interpret it the way they want. And it makes it easier on the writer. So it's more gone the way towards screenplays. But a lot of that is learning how to write concise, funny dialogue, but also writing concise, instructive scene descriptions so that people know what's going on, but you're not doing too much flowery stuff, or it's too long, or it makes it really boring, for people to read the script.
Okay. What do you like about writing for animation specifically?
I think one of the fun things about it is it can be almost anything you want in a lot of cases, unless you're doing a really heavy CG thing, which is a lot more like live action in that you have to be conscious of locations and setting and character count. Regular just 2D animation, you can almost go anywhere and do anything, and that makes it really really fun. You can play out ridiculous gags, you can do stupid stuff, you can do all that great, Ren and Stimpy, Rick and Morty kind of craziness, which is, I think, the real power of that medium, is doing that kind of stuff.
And you've written for quite a few superhero shows as well. So, what are the differences between writing something for a superhero like Spider Man, for example, and writing a Scooby Doo episode?
Well, Spider-Man is sort of more inherently dramatic. It's sort of, a lot of times they use the phrase action comedy, and it really is more action comedy. Whereas I would say Scooby-Doo is comedy action, if that makes sense. Scooby-Doo starts more from a comedy perspective because that's just who he is, right? But Spider-Man starts more from an action perspective. And they're both in their own unique ways about empowerment, which I like. That's where their similarities are. Spider-Man is a teenager trying to figure it out, and how do I defeat this guy in the rhino suit while I have a math assignment due tomorrow? And Scooby-Doo is about, overcoming your fears. He and Shaggy are the fraidy cats, and who are obsessed with food. And it's like, how do we get to see them overcome their fears, and how do they do it so that it's also funny too? Whereas Spider-Man, that twist would be in a more dramatic fashion, a more dramatic way, and his problem solving is, he has to protect people. He has to actually save people from real threats. Whereas in Scooby-Doo, in the end, right, they pull the hood off the guy. It's Mr. Carstairs, right? I would have done it if it weren't for you meddling kids, right? We see it's all, hokum. It's somebody trying to put one over on us. So I think those are the main differences.
And how did you come to work on Scooby Doo and Guess Who?
A good friend of mine, Mike Ryan, was the producer on the show. So he called me up and said, "Do you want to do some?" I said, "Sure." And I'd worked with Mike on several shows, and so that was really really fun to have a chance to do that.
And how is it decided as to who might be writing what episode?
That's totally usually up to the production staff. What's going to happen? I know on that particular show, in a lot of cases it was, you have to go out and see, okay, here's a list of people we'd love to have on the show as guest stars. Let's go out and see if they could possibly do it. And then in some cases you get back, they can't do it, or they'd like to do it. Will it fit in their schedule? Those kinds of things. There's a lot of practical considerations on that. And then I know, like with the Funky Phantom episode, they just knew they wanted to do a Funky Phantom episode. And they knew I had a reverence and sort of knew all those old Hanna-Barbera shows. And so they knew I could sort of handle the voices on that. And so that was, that turned out really, really fun to be able to do that. And then at the end to throw in not only the Funky Phantom, but a Goober and the Ghost Chasers gag, because Goober and the Ghost Chasers was basically Scooby-Doo done by the Ruby Spears gang. It was sort of a derivation on that. So that was really fun to be able to throw all that together, and that they said, yeah, let's do that. I was like, okay.
Do you ever get to toss in any input as to what guest stars you might want to write an episode for?
I remember having some discussions with Mike about that. Like, have you asked about this person? Have you asked about that person? And, it's so complex because you don't know, have they already asked that person? Do they maybe not have that person on their list? Because I mean, like, especially in today's Hollywood, what is their reputation like? Do we want to put them on a kids show? Are they known for, what's their reputation, family wise? Are they, as they would say, family friendly? There's just so many considerations. Are they doing a movie maybe with Warner Brothers? And it would be great to have them on the show because that helps support all the product that's going out. So there's a lot of different considerations that go into it. And so I think, like a master list is made up and then they throw stuff in there. And try to do it. I know we tried to do an episode. We tried to come up with an episode for Jabberjaws, and that involved C-Lab. Was it C-Lab 2020, I think, and Jabberjaws, and we just couldn't quite make it work. It just didn't all quite hold together. So sometimes that happens too. You write out a premise and you say, hey, this would be great. Let's do Jabberjaws and let's make it underwater and it'll be crazy. And it just doesn't work out.
How much freedom do you have in the writing process? Are you given an idea of what the plot should look like, or can you just run wild with the characters?
Oh no, it's all very it's sort of strictly laid out. It's sort of like a logic problem. So, the process is you'll get a premise, you know, uh in this case the premise for like Funky Phantom I remember was, they're visiting a Civil War battlefield and, they come across these ghosts and are they, what's going on here and how do we explore the competition between the two teams? And that was sort of laid out that way by Mike because the historical aspect to the Funky Phantom, and so we were folding in the history of the Civil War. I was sort of I'm a history buff, so I love the Civil War. So we were sort of careful. I was careful to make it a fictitious Civil War battlefield because I didn't want it to seem um, too irreverent to make it a real Civil War battlefield that all this crazy stuff was happening on. So you start with a premise and everybody approves it or goes around and makes their notes and this is what we should. And then you go to an outline. So if a premise is 1 to 2, sometimes 3 pages, the outline will then usually be 10 to 12 pages, and you lay out again more of the action. You actually lay out where the scenes will be. Again, you get more notes, and then you go to script. So it's all sort of carefully orchestrated and laid out and sort of building, starting with the skeleton, building the inner structure, building the outer structure, and then, laying it all out there. So it's kind of like building a building. You got to start with plans, then you got to put up the skeleton of the building, then you got to put up that, the exterior, and then you got to finish out the insides of it. So it's a lot like that.
And is the monster of the week decided in that premise too, or do you get some input?
Usually, yeah. Usually, the monster of the week is going to be decided in the premise. So the premise will basically give you the beginning, the middle, and the end. It lays that out so that you have an actual story because a story is a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you usually get that laid out, usually by premise. And that doesn't mean it can't change. That somebody might say, that villain's too close to one we've already used, or we've already got one that's already going forward, or somebody might say, what if we changed it, it made it like this? And so in a lot of cases, but in a lot of cases, by the time you go to outline, you know who your bad guys are and basically what your beginning, your middle, and your end is.
And what's your specific writing process?
Well, it's sort of that, in some cases on shows, depending on the show you're working on, they'll want you to do premises. So you can sit down and write 10 or 12 premises for a show. You'll know the basic concept. They're heading into the writing process and you submit those premises and then you get feedback. And then they'll say, we like this one. Let's push it forward and let's do that. In the case of the Guess Who scripts, they already knew what they wanted to do just because that show sort of needed to, with the timing of having guests coming on and off, they sort of needed to know what direction they were going in to begin with. So I think they had a master list of here's who we're trying to get, here's how we're going to make it work. And so they came to me already had a premise, sort of, Funky Phantom set on a Civil War battlefield. It's a competition between the Funky Phantom crew and the Scooby crew. And it's like, okay. And then it's building the story out from there. For me, it's about, sitting down every day and having to write. You got to sit down every day and you got to write and you got to hit those sort of your target deadlines of, I do a lot of stuff where, let's say I've been given the go to script and I know a script is going to be usually between 28 and 35 pages. I'll actually break down and say, okay, I in order to hit the deadline, I got to write 5 or 6 pages a day. And you sit down and you try to do that. And some days maybe you'll write 8 and some days you'll write, fewer because you're being lazy or you're just stuck with a certain problem. And sort of that's sort of the basics of it.
What is it like to be able to write for these iconic characters?
Well, like I said, for me, it's pretty cool because having worked at Hanna-Barbera, working on Scooby and having, gotten to do, I remember I got to revise one of the bios on Dawes Butler. So I got to take him to lunch and talk to him about his career and all the stuff he'd done, from Boo Boo Bear to, Scooby to Astro to all these, to Johnny Quest. And so to me, it's great to be able to I sort of hear those voices in my head when I'm doing it, and then to be able to, voice the Funky Phantom, done by another great voice actor, Dawes Butler, who I got to meet and interview and sit down in his home studio with. And he was fantastic. And so it was great to hear these guys. And they'd been old radio guys, so they got used to performing. I think both of them did radio content during World War II, where in a lot of cases they played all the characters. And so frequently in the studio, when both Dawes and Don were performing, the audio engineers would have to tell them, can you redo that sequence because you didn't leave enough spaces between the characters? Because they were able to switch from one character to another so quickly because they were used to doing it on radio, that the editors didn't have enough space in there if they needed to put a cut between the characters. So they'd have to tell them to spread it out a little bit as they switched. And so, to be able to write for the voices that I talk to them about and can hear in my head, it was really fun.
Who's your favorite character of the gang to write for?
It's got to be Shaggy and Scooby. Although Velma, I like writing for Velma too, because you can, Velma, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of exposition going on there, but she's also smart. So it's great. You can drop the knowledge in there and the crazy science stuff. And it's always fun to have a character like that. Like I wrote on the Back to the Future animated series too, and Doc Brown, right? Let's drop in all kinds of crazy. I did a baseball episode, so he's dropping in all kinds of crazy statistics about baseball because that's who he is. So it's always really fun to have smart characters too,
Definitely. And were you able to be present for the record for both of those episodes that you wrote?
Those I was not. In many cases you can be, but I know in that case the schedules were just so crazy and demanding, and getting like guests together with all that, it didn't work out. I was kind of bummed because I love Weird Al, and I'd actually met Weird Al before, and he's very personable and very charming and very sort of self-effacing. He's just a great guy, and he's sort of, he has a great outlook on the fact that he's become this sort of famous song parodier. And so I was bummed that I couldn't get to go see the records, but I understand too, in the when you're doing a production schedule, sometimes it just doesn't work out. You just can't invite everybody who'd like to be there.
Of the 2 episodes you wrote, do you have a favorite?
I am sort of partial to the Funky Phantom episode, only because it's such classic Hanna-Barbera, and it's one of those things that back in the early days at Hanna-Barbera when I started, they probably wouldn't have done a crossover like that because sort of the eras didn't match. And it was like by the time I was there when Pup Named Scooby-Doo was going on, they probably wouldn't have dropped Funky Phantom into a Pup Named Scooby-Doo because they would have just said, well, who cares? But it's such a great mashup now of some of the classic Hanna-Barbera stuff that I love being able to do that. I think being able to do Weird Al stuff was really fun, but having classic Hanna-Barbera stuff thrown in there to me was the real treat.
More generally, what's your favorite show that you've written for, or do you have a favorite episode that you've written over everything that you've done?
Oh, wow. So there was a show done years ago that I loved called Bruno the Kid. And it was Bruce Willis's Bruno character, his band, his harmonica playing band character. But he was a kid spy called Bruno the Kid. And what was great about those shows was they were incredibly silly spy things. They were written by guys who had done sitcoms, and so they had a very sitcom sensibility, and I got to throw in jokes I never thought would get into an animated show, and those turned out really great. Those were some of the most fun I've had. I think other than that, my run on Spider-Man, being on staff on Spider-Man for all those years, it took us like 4 or 5 years to get all that done, was really great. It's still, I think that show still holds up. It was really great to work on some of those classic episodes and classic villains. That first season, there were a lot of meetings, and in those meetings, Stan Lee would be in the meetings, and so you'd get to hear Stan's input and talk to Stan about stuff, and that was really, really fun and important. And then, a lot of the stuff I did with Lego was really fun too, because Lego has this great sense of like family friendly snark. So I got to, like doing a Lego version of the Avengers is really fun because you get to poke fun at like Thor, in this Lego-y fun way. And I was a particular Thor, I was always told I was going too far with Thor because he has that weird theatricality, right? And they're like, yeah, you've gone too far with Thor. You need to pull Thor. Okay, but it was like, doing jokes like, they're having a party and there's a bowl of mini meatballs. The mini meatballs are cold. This is a job for Mjolnir. And he'd strike them with lightning. And it's such a stupid joke and such a stupid thing to use with his magic hammer, reheating meatballs. But it was really, really fun to do stuff like that, and people really sort of saw the fun of being able to do a Legoized version of something. Like I did Lego Frozen. What was great about doing Lego Frozen was all of the original voice. I think we had every original voice actor come in from Frozen and do the Lego version because they were like, yes, we want to do the Lego version. And it was like, oh okay, fantastic. Come on in and do it. It was really fun.
That sounds like so much fun.
That one was fun. I got to actually be in the booth for that. And what was great was I got to do a lot of they wanted extra lines and improv lines, and so we got to do a lot of that. That was really fun, being able to throw in lines, from listening and hearing them do a line and go, oh, why don't you try it like this, or oh, how about this one, and I'd write one real quick and they'd put it in the booth, and that was really, really fun to do that.
And moving more specifically to A Mystery Solving Gang Divided, the Funky Fandom episode, what was it like to write a rivalry between the two groups?
That was really fun. I mean, it was really fun because you got to sort of play with all those tropes of the mystery hunting gangs and all that kind of stuff, and like how they were going to investigate it and how they, because they sort of all match up one-on-one, with each other in the gang. And so you could have these just funny, crazy rivalries. And of course, then the whole idea that, one group has a ghost with them and one group has a talking dog. And the fact that Scooby's afraid of ghosts and the ghost is afraid of ghosts. I mean, it was just stuff piled on top of stuff. And then of course they're actually solving a mystery too together. So that was really, really, really fun. And of course the fact that they have competing vehicles, and it was really, really cool, because I think that's always a fun way to do it when you have a rivalry like that. And so being able to write to that rivalry, it just naturally sets up all kinds of gags.
They're often knocking each other in the episode. Do you have a favorite jab or insult that happens in the episode?
I'm trying to remember. Gosh, this takes me back. There was some stuff I think that took place in the diner, where they're in the diner, and it's Fred going after the guy that leads the Funky Phantom group, and I can't remember that I remember that exchange specifically in the diner, and there's some pancake gags I think with Scooby, and so that to me was a really fun scene to write, because that sort of really sets up their rivalry, and it's really it's just sort of really, we see sort of Fred taken out of his cool exterior because he's feeling so like, I got to defend my turf.
And what was it like to bring back those older Hanna-Barbera characters and kind of reinvent them to the year that it is now?
Well, it's really fun. The other fun part about that is what I love now is when you need to do research on that stuff, right? If you just Google it, you're going to find it out there somewhere on YouTube, right? And so you get to see how those gags were played out. And that's why, especially on Funky Phantom, he had this classic gag he did when he was afraid, where he'd become like a window shade, which is kind of old, because I don't know if that many people have window shades anymore, right? We mainly have the blinds and those kinds of things, right? And he would pull on the bottom, the shade would roll up, and that's kind of a classic gag, that you pull on it and it zips up, and he would do that to get out of a scene. He'd be afraid and he wanted to get out, right? And he'd do zip, and or turn into suddenly he has a ghostly canoe and he'd paddle his way out of the scene, and it was it was so bizarre that I loved being able to play with that stuff, because that is very cartoony.
And you mentioned that you're a bit of a Civil War buff. What was it like to be able to kind of bring that aspect into it as well?
To me, that's the really cool stuff too, when you can bring in, hopefully something that you can say, okay, maybe they'll, kids watching or somebody will then get interested in the Civil War or want to know more, or say, was this a real battle, or what's going on? And so when you sort of bring in, at least just in that one, at least touching or a flavor of actual history, to me, that's always great, because then you can, especially in a show that's set sort of currently, not a sci-fi show or not, a Batman show that's set in an alternate world. You can bring in real world stuff, and hopefully you're getting people interested in stuff that, really they should be interested in it. They should be interested in that history.
Do you know what the thought process was to make the guest star Abraham Lincoln?
I do not. I think it was just that, it seemed like, Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, it was important. And so, let's make it about that. And, this important time period. And so I think it just worked out story wise. I think it just integrated really well in the fact that they were at a Civil War battlefield. And so, yeah, so let's bring in Lincoln,
Moving towards the Weird Al episode, what was your reaction when you found out you were going to be writing an episode with Weird Al in it?
I was so jazzed because I actually found it on YouTube. And I remember I was in Mike's office and I was saying, there is one of the earliest videos of Weird Al playing one of his parody songs. And I don't remember which song it was, but, Weird Al used to have a guy that would accompany him. Weird Al would be playing his accordion and singing, and this guy would be playing the suitcase, and he'd be banging on it like a drum, and he had like kazoos attached to it and bells. And it was the craziest, weirdest thing. And I just wanted to be able to push it in all directions. And I remember in early meetings, I was like, can I have a kid who wants to play the suitcase or the kazoo or whatever, and we tried to figure out, can we do that? Can we make it work? And then we specifically focused on, the accordion, that it was, because the accordion is a ridiculous instrument too,
And how difficult is it to write someone like that into an animated show?
Well, Weird Al, I mean, fortunately, Weird Al sort of has this big personality already, right? The aloha shirts and the wild hair and the glasses, and he plays an accordion, I mean, other than playing the bagpipe, I can't think of or a banjo, I can't think of a sort of a wilder, more comedic instrument, I mean, the accordion is great, because he can do stings, wee, he can play a crazy song all of a sudden, and he sort of lends himself to animation better than most because of who his persona is. And actually some of that isn't persona, that's just him, right? That's just sort of who he is and how he's established himself. And so it lends itself almost perfectly to being able to do that kind of crazy, wild stuff that you can do in animation.
And what do you have to do to stay true to his personality to get him in an animated episode?
Well, I think a lot of it is just knowing, do you sort of know his songography? Yeah. I remember watching more YouTube. Like I watched a lot of his videos again. I'd seen him before, but I think I watched like a Surgeon again, and Eat It. I think I watched Eat It because he has this very, again, like the Lego stuff. Weird Al has a very sort of family friendly snarkiness, right? It's not necessary. It's not mean spirited. He's skewering people by doing the songs he does, but it's very fun. And so it's from that fun point of view. And so same thing in the way that like Scooby-Doo has this sort of fun take on ghosts and what's going on and monsters and stuff like that. Weird Al lends to that because you can immediately break the tension if they're, say, sneaking through a cave and it's dangerous and he's playing musical stings on his accordion, right? It's just great.
And talking about those musical stings, did you write the words for those?
I wrote some words. I don't know how much of my original stuff got in because I know, he's such a creative guy that I know they allowed him the freedom to, like, if you want to do something, you can do something. If you want to follow what's down there, what's down there. In a lot of cases with voice actors, especially really talented voice actors, like Frank Welker, and I know with Dawes Butler and a lot of the other voice actors I've worked with throughout the years, you can say to them, just give me a couple of takes as written. And then they'll a lot of times they'll say, can I try something? Sure, please try something. Or they'll say, I have something I think would be fun. And they'll do their own take on stuff. And especially when you got a guy like Weird Al, you actually want that because it shows that they're sort of invested in the story and they're sort of invested in bringing their own voice to that story and how it can work. And that kind of stuff is really fun too.
And do you have a favorite part within that episode?
I would say I think I think there's a great part in there where he's all the kids are leaving or their parents are coming to pick him up, and he's talking to the kids, and we're first introduced to the camp kids and the whole accordion idea. And there's some great stuff there with just Weird Al and the fact that he's wearing an accordion the whole time. And then I think that the Scooby stuff where they're sneaking around and he's playing stings on the accordion, to me that's the kind of stuff that's like, it's so unique to his character that really no other character can do that, right? There's no other, character that can have an accordion strapped on and be doing stuff like that.
Moving back a little bit more generally, why do you think that a cartoon dog solving mysteries has had so much staying power over, the last 50 years?
Well, I think it's that it's the relationship between all of them, the gang and Scooby and Shaggy. It's really a family, it's sort of a crazy family, and they all have their roles, and they all do, certain things that are important to the group. And so it makes it this level of it's recognizable, it's sort of family friendly. You could sit down as a family and watch these shows, and everybody's going to get a little bit of something fun out of it. And I think just, the idea that it's a talking dog, I think we love to personify our pets and our animals that are around us. I have a dog. I love dogs. And so I'm always doing that. I know people do that with their cats, and the grumpy cat memes. And so I think being able to have this big, goofy, and he's a Great Dane, right? So, I think the only other one, like Marmaduke, they're sort of big, funny, goofy dogs that normally, if you looked at a Great Dane, you'd be quite intimidated by it. They're big animals, and I had a friend who had a Great Dane. He said, yeah, we had to be careful what we put on top of the refrigerator because he could actually stand on his hind legs and get to the top of the refrigerator. And you go like, Jesus, it's like a horse, right? It's not like a dog. And so I think the fact that it's a Great Dane that's goofy and funny and scared of stuff, and more actually like what Great Danes are, I think that's so relatable to people. And I think kids say, wow, I'd love to have a pet like that. If you don't have a pet, you want to have a pet like that. If you do have a pet, you want to think your pet is goofy and silly and funny like Scooby, but also could protect you, and be your pal. So I think that's a universal thing.
I think that covers all of the questions that I had for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add at all about Hanna-Barbera or Scooby or anything?
No, I just want to say, thanks to you, Alexa. It's always fun to talk to people who are, appreciative of this and into this and looking to ask more questions and learn about it. Again, having that curiosity for the world and figuring it out. The other thing I would say is I certainly hope that anybody that watched that Funky Phantom episode would want to learn more about Lincoln and the Civil War and particularly U.S. history about that era, because we're still living that era. We're still living the consequences of that war and those decisions. And those decisions, speaking of the Funky Phantom, go back to the founding of our country. And so you can trace that timeline all the way up to what's happening in modern times. And we can't understand what's going on with the protests and things on our streets now unless we go back and look at all that history and how far we've come. And so same thing with the Weird Al episode. I would hope that kids would want to learn more about dinosaurs, right? Because that's sort of a fun thing there. The fact that we put a paleontologist in there and actually had some stuff about dinosaurs in there. To me, let's let your inquiring mind go and really sort of look at that stuff and have fun and understand it.
Definitely. And just before we end here, do you have any recent projects that you'd like to promote?
I just did a series that was released last year on Netflix called Legend Quest, and it is like a Mexican version of Scooby-Doo. So it's produced by a Mexican animation company called Anima, and the difference is it's a gang of kids solving mysteries, but the monsters are real, and the monsters are from world myth and legend. So they go around the world trying to see what's going on with these world myths and legends, and there's a larger plot going on. So it is very serialized. It's really fun. Had a great time doing it. There's a lot of great monsters from the world in that series that you can look at and go like, oh, okay, well, here's here's some really great monsters we can look at and figure out who they are and how do they fit in the world. And like a Japanese tsukigama doll, that can turn people into dolls, and there's just creepy fun stuff in that. So if you get a chance, watch it. It's Legend Quest on Netflix.
Awesome. And do you have any social media channels where people can follow what you're up to?
I am on Twitter. I'm at Hoff Writes, HOFF Writes. I'm on Instagram at the same address. Yeah, at Hoff Writes. I'm also at Hoff Comedy because I've gone back to doing stand up and improv. So you can catch some of my comedy shows online and my silly things. I have a YouTube channel. If you go to Mark Hoffmeier YouTube, you can see some of my crazy comedy stuff on there as well. And I have a comedy bit I do about my time on Power Rangers. So that was fun too.
Awesome. Well, perfect. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Mark.
Oh, thank you, Alexa. Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed it. So thank you.
And that concludes today's episode. Another huge thank you to Mark Hoffmeier for taking the time out to be on the show. For more groovy content, be sure to check at Unmasked SD on Twitter, at Unmasked SD Podcast on Instagram, or at unmaskedsdpodcast.com. If you like this episode and want to hear more, also make sure to check those social media channels or the website. Or you can listen to older episodes wherever you like to get your podcast fix. And if you want to follow Mark, you can find him on Instagram and Twitter at HoffWrites or at HoffComedy. Thanks for listening, and keep an ear out for the next episode. Scooby-Doo!